If that had not happened, I'd have ambled through life pretending or feeling that I was successful. But the success of that business and that journey and the houses and the cars created a false sense of security that said, I know what I'm doing. And I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know that until I'd lost everything.
Welcome to Doing the Opposite, Business Disruptors, conversations with Jeff Dewing, where we explore how rethinking is possible and how it can transform leadership, business, and life itself. Jeff is the founder and CEO of Cloudfm Group, a keynote speaker, best-selling author, and a man who's rebuilt his life by doing exactly that, the opposite. Jeff has lived through the kind of story that most people still only read about. He went from owning a football club and a successful business to losing everything, all the way down to £7.60 in his bank account. And then he rebuilt it into a £65 million enterprise. I'm Sam Walker, and in each episode, Jeff and I dig into one powerful theme from his story and how it can inspire better culture, leadership, and impact. Today, we'll explore what it means to start over, to lead through failure, and to find strength in vulnerability. Jeff, welcome.
Thanks, Sam.
So take us back to that moment. You've talked about waking up one morning, realising that everything had gone. What was going through your head?
I can't explain it really. I mean, if you can imagine what it's like waking up to a knock at the door at 7:30 and it's a man coming to collect your two cars and the wife saying, Jeff, who's his man? I'm saying, I don't know. And he's saying, well, if you pay me 10,000, you can keep them. And you're sitting there going, well, there's just no way. And and then it's looking next door to see if the neighbours are looking out the window. And I can't begin to explain the moment other than having to live through it in what seemed like slow motion. And whilst I'm trying to deal with the guy at the front door, the kids are waking up for school, Daddy, who's the man? And you just... I can't even begin to explain what it felt like. And you go through that process and then the two cars disappear off the drive. And I'm sort of sitting there in this daze and you're looking at the ceiling thinking, how has this even happened? How did I not see this coming? Why did I think that burying my head in the sand meant the problems would go away? Yeah, what do I do next? And it was that moment of everybody around me wanting explanations that I couldn't give. And that was the piece that was tough.
But you've also talked about actually in that moment, really surprisingly, actually feeling a sense of freedom.
Well, during that first few days of it happening, it was crushing. It wasn't a sense of freedom. The sense of freedom came when you accept where you are. It is what it is. You can't change it. And then suddenly the burden is lifted that I've now not got to go and speak to loads of people about why I couldn't pay them, why the business had gone bust, and saying to my father, can I borrow your car because I need to go out and get some stuff for the family? And yeah, I'd never even said to my parents, who I love dearly and we're very close to, I didn't even, the subject never rose. It wasn't, Jeff, what's happened? They'd obviously worked it out. They protected sort of some of my humility or my integrity by sort of not challenging me on it and saying, what on earth happened, Jeff? And so they protected me to that extent that they didn't make me go through it again with them. But it wasn't until sort of a month afterwards where everything had sunk in and it was what it was that I went, wow, suddenly I've now got no responsibilities because I've got this freedom of not having to go to an office every day, not having to face staff that are asking me why they're not being paid. And so that part of it was the sense of relief. But what stopped the pure relief and the pure freedom was knowing that, what do I do next? How do I solve this problem? How do I protect the family? How do I feed the family? And how do I overcome how I'm feeling? So that was a good sort of 6 months of real emotional pain.
I mean, you ultimately, of course, turned all of that loss into a new philosophy. Mm-hmm. But before we dig into that, just take me back then to your early life and the events that had led up to this devastation.
I had started out in business or in a career as an apprentice in a refrigeration company where my father was a fridge engineer. And he said to me once when I was growing up, And we were going through the period of school where you get the careers office and, I want to be a bricklayer, I want to be a plumber, I want to be a secretary, I want to be a nurse, and all the various bits and pieces. And I said, I want to be a fridge engineer. And the guy said, what's that? Because it wasn't a normal career approach, right? So people would go into a supermarket in Sainsbury's and they'd buy their, their Anchor butter or their frozen food. They had no idea what made those fridges cold, whereas I was fascinated. And I was lucky enough that my father had been a fridge engineer and he would sort of give me the gist of it. And he said one thing to me during my early career discussions at school, and he said, a good fridge engineer is never out of work because they're in such high demand. And that sort of stuck with me, and that's why I decided, apart from following my father's footsteps, I wanted to become a fridge engineer. So eventually I got a job as an apprentice, and I was on £33 a week. Prior to that, when I was about 14, no, it's probably younger than that, 10 or 11, my father took me to karate. And of course, you think, great, I'm going to go and beat everybody up. It's fantastic. It's a boys thing, a bit of ego. And I turn up there and there's all these guys in gis with, purple belts and red belts and yellow belts and so on. And I walk up and the sensei says, no, you roll your jeans up and take your shoes and socks off. And you respect the dojo and whatever. So I'm thinking, well, I want a gi. And it's no, you earn your gi. You have to do the training first. And the training was just doing exercises. And then after halfway through the process, you'd sit in a big circle and he would choose two people to spar, have a fight, using the skills that you'd learned. And I wasn't fighting. I'm going, I want to fight. I want to fight someone. And he said, no, you don't fight. Anyway, so I had to go through the boring stuff of the exercises and all the various things you had to do. And I said, I don't like this anymore. He said, it doesn't matter, son, you're going. So anyway, after about 2 or 3 months, he came home one day and he bought me a gi, and I'm a white belt because he just started. And then suddenly I started to grow the discipline and so on. And the point behind that little segment story is that you have to go through the pain to get the gain. In other words, you've got to do the shit before you get the glory. And when I was an apprentice, I was just lagging pipes and making tea and being abused by people slapping me around the head, calling me cocky all the time, which I was. But you had to go through it. And then suddenly, one day they said, Jeff, why don't you try brazing this bit of pipe? So I said, okay, I can do that. And I brazed this bit of pipe and I went, blimey, that's really, really good. And then that's the momentum. Then suddenly they saw I was useful. They got me to do stuff I enjoyed. But I had to do all the lagging stuff first. You had to learn the shit first before you get on to move the other stuff. And hence the karate segue. But so then I sort of, I just became super ambitious. I don't know why. I don't know if I became or if I always was, but I then said, no, I can see what guys are doing. I can see how well respected they are. I want to do the best bit of pipe work. I want to do, the neatest bit of pipe work. I want to do the bit of pipe work where someone goes, wow, we did that pipe work. So that was the drive for me. And then at 19 years old, at 16 years old, I'd said in the canteen one day, there's about 8 blokes there from, we're all working together installing this pipework. And I just stood up and everyone was always talking about stories of weekends. And I said, I'm going to be a supervisor at 19. And there was this pause and this silence. And I just looked around and said, I will be. They said, shut up, you numpty. We've been here 20 years. We've never made supervisor. So I said, no, I'm going to make supervisor. And they started throwing bacon rolls at me and all sorts of stuff. And fast forward, at 19, we was summoned to the pub in Hanwell where our office was, and the service manager stood up and there was 35, 40 of us there, and he said, we've got a promotion to announce. We're all sort of sitting in this big round table, and he suddenly chucked these car keys across to me. He said, Jeff Dewing is the new and most importantly youngest supervisor this company has ever employed. Oh, what? And what the beauty of the keys was, as engineers you had vans. When you're a supervisor, you get in your estate car. And suddenly I've got this estate car and I'm thinking, what? So although for the moment it was great, there was silence in the room. So where you'd have liked to have everyone sort of clap and go, well done, Jeff, well done, there was silence. So although I enjoyed that moment, the moment lasted about 10 seconds because then I was ostracised by people. So I had a journey to go on for the next 2.5 years where I had to get all those people on side somehow. And it was tough. So I guess the lesson I learned from that, which I reflected on later in life, was when you say it out loud, you create accountability. So I was going hell for leather to achieve it. My marriage failed because I was working 100 hours a week. I loved what I did. So for me, it wasn't work. And because I was never at home, the relationship broke down. So I got divorced at 22, 23. And then I met my new partner at the time, about 6 months later. And she was used to me working all these hours, so suddenly it was normal. But she then said to me at the time, and she was pregnant with our first child between me and Michelle, and she said, "You're not doing these stupid hours. You need to look after the kids with me. You can't be doing all this stuff. I need you at home." So I said, "Well, this is what I do. This is what I love." And so she goes, "No, you're going to get an office job." I said, "No, I'm not." She said, "Yes, you are." The next thing is I come home one Tuesday or Wednesday afternoon. He said, "I've got you an interview tomorrow at this company called Airstream in Colchester." I said, what interview? She goes, "Air conditioning manager." I said, "Manager? I don't know anything about managing. I bend pipe." So she said, "No, you're going for it." So I went for this interview and they said, "So can you design refrigeration air conditioning?" I said, yeah. I bullshit my way right away through it. Couldn't do any of what they asked me, but I said I could. And then I had to learn very quickly how to design refrigeration. So I got the job. And now I've got a company car. I'm in a suit. I've got a company phone in the car. Suddenly it's like, wow. But the difference was I went from earning probably nearly £30,000 a year at the time because of all the hours I was working to a salaried job where you don't get paid overtime for $16,000. So it was a big hit on the salary, but it meant I was going to be home weekends. It meant I was going to be home at 6 o'clock every night.
Did that bother you? Were you driven by money at this stage?
No. But you live to your means, right? So if you're earning 30,000 quid a year, you're spending 25 grand, right? So to go to 16,000 meant there was a lot of cutbacks that had to take place. Anyway, I went into the office, and of course, when you're an engineer, you think everyone in the office is just there with their feet up on the table, answering the phone, and then sending you to a job. You didn't think they did everything else. You're the people that are spending all the profit I'm making while I'm doing the work, because you had no appreciation. There was no communication. No one ever really knew what was going on in a business. So anyway, I went to the office and realised it was a lot more to than putting your feet up on the desk. So I then learned how to project manage very, very quickly. I learned how to manage subcontractors. I learned how to do quotations. I learned how to manage engineers. I was sending to do different jobs. So this was a whole new world. And it was all done with what in those days was a T-card system. You had a metal bracket on the wall and a load of T-cards, and you put, service call at Sainsbury's so put it in there. You give it to an engineer, write the engineer's name, you put it in the next slot. Engineer gets on site, you put it in the next slot. And I'm sitting there thinking, God, is this where we are on bits of paper? So I went and bought a computer, which I knew nothing about. And it was an Amstrad 1640 with two 5.25-inch floppy disks. And I phoned my old man up. I said, "Dad, I've bought this computer and I plugged it on, and there's this C just flashing on the thingy, and I can type keys, but it don't do nothing." He said, "No, son, you've got to load a program." I said, "What do you mean load a program?" "You've got to put a program in it." So then I realised the DOS-based system is just an operating system you have to put in, in that we know today, Word, Excel, etc. Well, in this case, you had to put in a desktop publishing, you put a program in, then you operate it. So suddenly I now got the concept of how a computer works. So I found this service manager program, which enabled me to start managing service calls and contracting and project management. And then I started playing with it and started to understand. I just sat up for hours every night just playing with this stuff until eventually I built this system. It took me a year in my own time, evenings, weekends, and I built this system that automated everything I did in that business. And when I was employed, they said, "We want you to grow the air conditioning business to £1 million a year. That's our target." And I said, "Well, what's your turnover now?" They said, 160 grand. So I said, "Okay, I've got a job with my hands in." They said, "Yeah." So I had to become a salesman. I had to go meet clients. I had to try and sell air conditioning. I had to design it. I had to project manage it. And then I had to invoice it. So I had to do the whole full cycle process. And I built this computer system that automated everything. And we was doing service calls, maintenances, installations. And I went to them at the end of this 12 months. And it was also at the end of the financial year where we'd done £1.1 million of air conditioning. So they sort of rose a glass of wine to me and said, "Well done, Jeff, you smashed £1 million." And I said, I want to show you something. So I showed them this computer, showed them what it did, and they went, "Wow, that is amazing. How did you do all that?" So I told them the story. I said, "I worked all, blah, blah, blah." So they said, that's wonderful, great. Well, so now we can hit the £1 million again next year. So I said, "Well, there's only one little thing I want to ask you." And they said, "What's that?" I said, "Well, the computer cost me £1,000, which meant for the last 9 months I've been a month in arrears on my mortgage because I used my mortgage money to buy the computer. Bearing in mind I was already under the cost of 16 grand a year." I said, "So if you could buy the computer, which will sit here anyway, everything will run smoothly." And they went, "No, we're not paying the computer."
Wow. So you just put 900,000 on their business and they wouldn't.
Yep. And on top of that, I built it all myself in my own time. And I said, "Really? Why is that?" They said, "Well, we don't see the need to buy the computer." I said, "But if you don't buy the computer, you won't have the systems." So they said, no, Jeff, no, we're not buying a computer." That was just very old school. I said, "Okay, no problem." So I didn't want to have a fight over it. So I just took it back home, And then about a week later, they went, how's the computer system going? I said, it's switched off. I said, what do you mean it's switched off? I said, well, you wouldn't buy the computer. I've had to sell the computer to get my money back. You wouldn't buy it. So they said, okay, we can go back to the T-card system then. Oh, by the way, we don't really want to go above £1 million. Just keep it £1 million and we'll be happy. And I sat for, what on earth is this? Anyway, in the meantime, during that year, I'd learned everything I needed to know. So I went, I'm starting my own business. So that was the catalyst to make me say, I'm going to go and do it for myself.
So your catalyst was different, though, when you launched Cloud, because you talked about the fact that the first time around, you said you kind of built everything for the wrong reasons. So what was that pivot between that first business that you set up that ultimately failed, and then what was different about when you launched Cloud?
It was massively different. And I think the way to answer that question is, why did I then start my own business? Well, firstly, I was under the pressure of only being on 16 grand a year.
So motivated by money.
At that point, it was I needed to pay the bills. It wasn't about I wanted more money. It was about I needed to pay the bills. But then suddenly, when I'd realised that I'd learned not only the engineering side of what I'm doing, I now learned how to do the office side of it and the administration side of it, and I learned how to improve administration so much by my intrigue in computers and efficiency and drive and so on, that I said, right, I can now start my own business. So, and at that point, I started the business not just because I wanted to get the salary to a level that was okay, but I wanted to go beyond that. I then wanted the nice cars and the big house and all the other stuff. So it was, I could make a lot more money. So it was money focused. But at the same time, I wanted to get relieved of the constraints of people that I thought, why are you even getting out of bed every day if you just want to do the same thing? It frustrated me. So I wanted to do more than that, which was driven by money. Whilst I was doing that, the focus then was on, how do I make good money to have a financially free life, be successful, be proud, and be able to say to my family, my parents particularly, because my dad had run his own business all of his life, and he'd had a comfortable life, but he just kept it the same level all the time. He had no material drive to go further. But I wanted to push the boundaries, predominantly for my parents, particularly my dad, to be proud. And that was the drive. But at the same time, I wanted to earn money. So I ended up, our first year forecast for turnover for EAC, the first business, was 110,000. And 110,000, we were not going to draw much salary. We were going to draw 14 grand. So I was under a bit of pressure anyway. I took our bank loan out, which is a government-backed loan, which meant it was a £20,000 loan, which meant I could buy a van and a car and blah, blah, blah. And off we went. So, but what happened in the first year, we were so successful that I actually hit £1 million the first year. And then suddenly it's like, well, we got some money in the bank. And then I bought a house with Michelle and we'd set all the business up in the house before we bought offices and so on and so on. So, and it just went from strength to strength to strength. Everyone's going, wow, Jeff, you're doing well, you're doing well. Then we opened up our offices and they looked fantastic, and it was going on so well. And of course, at the time, we were drawing healthy salaries, and it was all fantastic. But it was all, I had to run everything. I was doing the invoicing, I was doing the VAT returns, I was doing the IT, I was doing the HR. I was also going out and helping my business partner install the kit, because it was everything, right? It was relentless, although I loved it. But it never stopped. It just never, ever stopped. And for 5-6 years, we grew it to 5-6 million quid. And that was pretty much the story. And then I got to 6 million quid. And I thought, I want to go further. But I couldn't get any further. I couldn't get over the 6 million. I employed big hitting people. I employed people that were much, much more experienced than I was, paid them double the salary I was paying myself. And they all delivered the square root of zero. So I lost interest. I just got frustrated. And then I started to fall out of love very quickly. And then the opportunity came up to buy Clacton Town Football Club. And that takes me into a whole new chapter.
We know ultimately that, Jeff, your business wasn't successful, that you ended up losing the club that you were so passionate about. But it was almost like you had to lose everything in order to learn how to lead differently. What does failure mean to you? And what do you think is the biggest misconception that most people have about failure?
Well, until you experience it, and I'm talking about materially experience it, most people are just complacent. So I guess you have to have a big hit before it hits you. I tell this story about when you teach your kids to ride a bike. You say to them, don't fall off, you hurt yourself. You give them the arm pads, you give them whatever. You're holding their seat. You're panicking when they're riding that first few meters on their own. And what we all miss is they actually don't learn until they fall off, right? And it's that simple. And all you got to do is make sure when they fall off, they don't hurt themselves a lot. But they've got to hurt themselves. They've got to feel the consequence of the action. So, and the second that someone falls off, it's like I had my first accident in my van. When I first had a van, I hit a lorry up the arse and caved the front of the car up. Thank God I wasn't injured. But since that moment, touch wood, I've never had another accident, because you have to have the accident to appreciate how easy it is to have the accident. So when I then sort of bought the football club, I learned something about myself that I never knew. And that was that I could inspire people. I wasn't the manager. I wasn't the tactician. But I created an environment where the same players felt totally different to the way they'd felt before. And suddenly we was winning everything. But nothing had changed other than the environment. And I'd learned that I could inspire people, which wasn't something I'd appreciated before. So I got so headstrong into the club to the fact I was spending 40 hours a week there. I took my eye off the business. A couple of my colleagues said, I'd like to run the business. It's our opportunity to grow ourselves. So I said, yeah, okay, fine, I'll give you a go, because I want to focus over here. And then after about 3 or 4 years, we won everything in the football club. I was loving life. And I was becoming well known in the town because I put the football club back on the map, because we was on the TV. We was progressing the FA Cup. We was winning prize money left, right and centre. And I was loving it, absolutely loving it. And then one day I got a phone call and said, Jeff, can you come in the business? There's a problem. So I went in and I said, what's up? They said, we run out of cash. I said, why didn't you wave the white flag sooner? And they said, we thought we could trade out of it. So I said, okay, let's have a look. Dug deep into it, looked at the history and went, yeah, we are in the shit. And they said, look, we're so sorry. I said, no, this is my responsibility. I left you to do this. I should have spent more time with you. I didn't. So don't you start feeling guilty about this. You've been doing something for my benefit. So this is my fault. I then realised that it was beyond repair. So that then led up to the failure of the bankruptcy and whatever. What does that mean to me? Well, to lose some money, or to lose a good member of staff, or to lose a car in a write-off, they're all just, minor little hiccups in life. To lose your entire business and your life, and to have your house taken and your cars taken, that's when you realise what failure means. And I can say it now. I couldn't have said it at the time, but that was the single biggest lesson in life I'd ever had. And if it wasn't for that, I guarantee you I wouldn't be where I am today. If that had not happened, I'd have ambled through life pretending or feeling that I was successful. But the success of that business and that journey and the houses and the cars created a false sense of security that said, I know what I'm doing. And I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know that until I'd lost everything. But
you then went from that moment of realization, you then still did have to rebuild. You had to go into job centres and be told you were too overqualified. You had to start from scratch, knowing what you already knew, but knowing that hadn't worked. So how did you keep going? Where did that resilience come from?
The one thing my family, my father particularly, my mother as well, to be fair, said to me continuously through my life, whatever happens to you in life, son, is your fault. It's nobody else's fault. And you have to take responsibility for where you are. It's nobody else's fault. And that was drummed into me from when I was a child, when I used to complain about my sister caused me to do this and my sister made me angry. No, you made you angry. So it was that consistent process which stuck in my head. So that's why, when it all failed, and a lot of it failed because people hadn't paid me, and it would have been easy for me to say, well, it's their fault because they didn't pay me. But I didn't have my eye on the ball. I could have done things differently, quicker, faster, whatever. So it still comes down to being my fault. Whereas a lot of people would blame the world for what happened to them. And I'd been taught through my childhood that that's not how it works. So for me, going through that journey and having to rebuild, the resilience came from, you got two choices. You sit and hide for the rest of your life and then regret what's happened to you, or you do something about it. Now, I'm not going to sit and say, oh, no, clever, I said I'm going to do something about it. It took me 6 months to have that viewpoint. It wasn't, the day after, right, Jeff, you've got to do something about it. I had to absorb, I had to feel the pain. And walking into job seekers, walking past people in the street, I said, morning, Jeff, because they knew me from the football club. Where you going? I'm going to job seekers, really? But you've always had flash cars and what? And that part was the tough part. And then sitting in job seekers and people saying to me, look, there's a job here for 16 grand a year. I said, no, I'm looking for 60 grand a year. And they'd look at me like, you don't come in job seekers asking for 60 grand a year. Who do you think you are? And it's like, oh my God, this is tough. And then eventually I got an interview and they said to me, oh, well done, you've got an interview. And it was for head of contracts in a refrigeration company in Surrey. And the salary was 60,000 quid a year. And they said, how are you feeling about this interview? I said, well, I'm quite nervous. I had an interview for like 15 years. So they said, well, you do realise that being on job seekers, you get an allowance for a suit, don't you? You get £150 for a suit. I said, really? Now, bearing in mind, I actually didn't have the money to buy a suit if I wanted to. So they paid me 150 quid for a suit to go for a 60 grand job. And the woman saying to me is thinking, you're taking a piss, I asked for 150 grand for a suit, you're going for a 60 grand job. And it was all everything was surreal. It was all crazy. But anyway, so I got the job and managed to come off for job seekers. But I never forget that first job seekers check that come through for 220 quid. And you sit and think, my God, I've never been on job seekers in my life. And people would say to me, don't worry, Jeff, you've been paying into the system for the last 25 years. So don't, I said, it's not about that. But it showed you how tough it can actually be getting a job because I'd never been in that situation. So all of that stuff was making me appreciate how tough it was, whereas before it all felt easy.
So if leaders listening to this, watching this, are going through a moment of crisis, whether it's personal, whether it's financial, what for you is that first step towards rebuilding? Is it accepting responsibility for what's happened? Is that where it starts?
It starts with saying this is nobody's fault but yours. And even if you try to convince yourself that some other activity, function, scenario has caused your situation, you have to accept the only thing that whatever happens to you in life is your fault. Is that simple? That's the first step. The second step is doing something that's probably I've learned since is the most powerful thing you can ever do. That is to give yourself time and space to think and to reflect. And I had a garage in my garden and I used to sit in the garage on my own for hours just looking at the ceiling and just thinking about all the stuff that had happened, what could have happened, what should have happened, what did happen. And it was just playing it back and getting clarity around all these things. Whereas if your mindset is saying, I need to understand who, avoiding swearing, I need to understand who it is that's fucked up my life. And it's not about that. That's the wrong mindset. It's about saying to yourself, how did this happen? What could I have done differently? What did I do that I could have done better? And it's giving yourself that time to reflect. That is the most powerful thing. And I took, probably after getting to the point where saying I've got to do something, I spent the next 2 months just reflecting before I said, right, I now know what I've got to do.
That must have been a really uncomfortable place to sit, though.
It was, because you've got to bear in mind, I'm sitting in my dressing gown all day. I've got no reason to get dressed, right? I'm in my dressing gown in my garage. I've got, Michelle coming out to me saying, are you just going to do this every single day? And I'm going, yep, because I didn't want to be pestered. And of course, she's thinking, it's all over for him. He's gone. His head's gone. But I was just sitting in deep reflection in my own space, just thinking about stuff. And that later, which we'll talk about another time, but that later point of realising the power of reflection is what I've then used so much more over the last sort of decade that it's been transformational.
We're going to get into all of that. Jeff, thank you. That's really fascinating. And thanks for being so honest about everything that really started you on this journey. If today's episode resonated with you, do share it with someone who needs to hear that starting over can be possible. Next time, we're going to dive in doing the opposite. Business Disruptors, challenging business norms, where Jeff reveals how defying conventional wisdom really led to groundbreaking innovation. Until then, keep questioning, keep leading, keep doing the opposite. To find out more, do head to jeffdewing.co.uk. Big thank you to Nicola Crawshaw at Cloud and also Michael Blades at What Goes On Media. I'm Sam Walker, and Doing the Opposite Business Disruptors is a What Goes On Media production.